I recently made a video that was all about creating spouts for jugs. And in it, I showed this vessel. It's a pourer of sorts with a thrown spout that's cut in half and attached to the pot. And well, a number of you left comments asking about it and wondering how it was made. So in this video, I'll be showing you how I throw them, trim them, and assemble the two parts. But before we begin, here's a quick demonstration to show you how this pot pours. And if you'd like to watch a longer video that's all about how to create spouts, good ways of practicing to make them, and how you can even use butter to fix a badly pouring lip, you can find all of that and more in the link on screen now and in the description below. I'll be making two new versions of this, with spouts that project at slightly different angles, as that's perhaps the one thing I didn't like with this first iteration. As always, I'll be using my regular high iron stoneware clay body for this. This is clay that I've reclaimed from other projects, the scraps being slaked down in water, dried out on plaster bats, and then wedged up thoroughly into the larger block you can see here. As for the two lumps of clay I'll be using to throw the pots with, I'm afraid I didn't weigh them out, but I imagine they're about ½ a kilo each. The lumps then given a quick knead to form them into more regular, round shapes, ready for throwing with on the wheel. The larger block you saw previously had already been thoroughly wedged, meaning it was void of any air pockets and was one even texture throughout already. I then force the clay to be centered, and sometimes it's easier to get there with some movement, so the piece of clay is coned up and down numerous times, as this helps to align the particles the material is made from, making it a bit more plastic and easier to throw with. And then I apply equal pressure from the side and the top to force the spinning lump of clay into a nice disc shape. With my forefinger and thumb, I then open the piece of clay up. I push them down to create a hollow in the middle, leaving about 4 or 5 millimeters in the base. And once that depth has been achieved, I can slide my fingers out horizontally to create the flat interior of the pot. I then push my knuckle into the outside of the base, scooping the clay inward as my fingers on the inside push out just above where my knuckle is, and this essentially extrudes the clay upward in a gap between my fingers. You can also use a sponge on the outside, like I'm doing here. It's soaked in water, and it can really help to do very even, smooth pulls, as it holds water and distributes it as your hands move up, keeping the material lubricated. You don't really want the clay sticking to your hands throughout this process, as if it does, the pot can be drawn off center, it can twist and buckle, and even collapse, so use of water is paramount so that our hands can interact with the clay without the two just sticking together. I then slide a twisted metal wire underneath the pot, separating it from the wheel, and then with dry hands and with the walls of the pot scraped clean of slip, I can quite easily lift the pot away. And for the second one, I'll be making the same shape again, although I really don't mind if the pots aren't identical. They just need to have a tapering bottom and a top section that slopes inward. The sloping top helps to direct liquid into the spout, whilst also creating a shape on the outside that's reciprocal for a spout to be attached, helping it to project at an upward angle, which should ultimately help it pour better. To finish these pots off, I first mop the water out from the inside, and then I use a sharp metal kidney to help me tidy up the exterior shape. I hold the tool itself steady, matching the profile of the shape I want, and then I push the walls out against this metal edge. This imparts a lot less force on the pot, as compared to simply digging the metal edge into the spinning piece of clay, which, as you can probably imagine, puts a lot of pressure on one spot, meaning the metal kidney would most likely catch, and the pot could very easily be distorted. You'll also notice a slight undulation in the rim of this piece, but for a pot like this, I really don't let that bother me. I can fix it at the leather hard stage, but as soon as the wheel stops spinning, you simply won't notice it. At the exact moment I lift the pot away, I also spin the wheel. It's just a touch, but it helps to break the sticky seal there is between the pot itself and the clay that's left over on the wheel head. Here are the two base shapes I'll be working with. I'll trim each of them to refine their shapes and to lighten them in terms of weight. The glazes that I use have to go on thickly, which means if I were to throw relatively balanced, sturdy pots and then cover them in a layer of thick glass, they could end up relatively heavy. so I prefer to trim my pots to be really quite light. This way they can take on a thick layer of glaze without ending up being heavier than I intended. I threw these pots first thing in the morning, and by 5 o'clock they were almost completely leather hard. In fact, this one had almost dried out too much, hence why I'm spraying water on the inside, as I won't trim these until the following morning, and I can't let them dry out too much overnight. Catching the clay at the perfect condition is vital when it comes to trimming. If it's too firm, you risk cracking the pot, as you need to apply a lot of pressure with the turning tools. And you'll also struggle to remove clay in any meaningful way, and if the clay is too soft, well, then you'll simply deform the pot as you press the turning tool against it. But before I can turn these, I first have to throw their spouts, which are simply tiny, thin cylinders. And to make these, I'll be throwing off the hump. This is a technique where you only throw a small portion of the lump of clay at the top. And when one small spout is finished, you can simply slice it away and then draw up more clay beneath it in order to throw another one. There's always a bit of an adjustment you have to make when throwing such small pieces, as you're no longer using your palms and your hands. Rather, it's mostly fingertip throwing, which is absolutely a skill in itself. To make sure the interior has a nice smooth surface, I insert a metal or wooden dowel and then push the clay from the outside against it. If the rim is wavering a bit too much, I'll slice away the undulation and then compress the rim with the chamois leather to round the lip. I then use a really sharp metal kidney and glide it down from top to bottom, scraping away excess slip, thinning out the walls, and creating a drier surface so this component can dry out more quickly in order to be attached to the body of the pourer. It also makes plucking this piece off the wheel easier. As for taking it off, I first create a groove around the bottom and then slide a wire through that groove using it like a guide. And then I can very lightly pick it off and then throw another. I know I said earlier don't dig the metal into the clay, but you can do it on this smaller scale, and I'm not just shaping the spout here. In fact, I'm thinning the walls out as I slide the metal down. And with hindsight, now that I've made these, I would have probably thinned these out even more. And I thought this was fascinating. You can actually see the clay shrink as I blast it with the heat gun. Although you might have to rewind in order to see it. Although I only need half a spout for each pot, I always prefer making more than necessary. This way I can pick and choose the best, and since these are still relatively new shapes to me, I'm still trying to figure out which form is best. The next step is to trim the bodies of these pourers. This one had turned somewhat oval as it dried, so I pressed a round pot into its opening as it spun. If you're doing this, just be careful not to press too hard, as if your clay is too soft, the rim will splay outward, and if the stoneware is too firm, there's a chance you can crack the lip. These pots were thrown relatively thinly to begin with, so there wasn't much to remove from their walls, but I could thin the lower tapering half so that it comes to a more narrow foot. I then slice the pot off the wheel after being slipped down securely in place. It's then flipped over onto its rim and I place 3 lumps of soft clay around it, holding it in place like the jaws of a chuck, like you might find on a lathe. To help keep the pot pinned down, I also use a spinner, which I can push down through. This tool distributes the pressure across the entire base, as otherwise, if I were using my fingertips, that pressure would be focused on one spot, and if the base of your pot is thin, you can easily indent it. As for trimming the base itself, I first turn a beveled edge around the outside, and then I trim clay away from the centre to create a very shallow footwell, both to remove excess material, to make the pot lighter, and to give it a very subtle, decorative finish, as opposed to the bottom just being flat. This is something I'm starting to do more and more. The foot is then burnished and stamped with my maker's mark, which is my signature, essentially, and that's one of these pots now ready for the spout to be attached. And the next pot was trimmed in exactly the same way. Although I did notice that the rim of this piece was slightly rough in a few spots, so in order to fix it, I placed the spinner on the inside so I can push down through it to pin the pot onto the wheel. I can then tap center the bat so the rim is spinning centrally, and then I can burnish the lip with the smooth portion of this plastic kidney, all whilst pushing down very firmly with my left hand, as this would be practically impossible to do without it, unless you supported the pot with lots of lumps of soft clay around the outside, which ends up just being relatively fussy and slow. And while I was at it, I burnished the rim of the other pot too. Now comes the interesting part. Up until this point, the throwing and trimming of these has been really standard, but attaching their spouts will be far more interesting. I begin by taking one of the spouts, which isn't quite leather hard, and I cut it in half. Now, as you can see, the walls on this piece are a bit thick, but beyond that, to correct the shape, I pinch the top in slightly. I can then place it roughly on the pot, and it's soft enough just to stick on, and then I score an approximate ring of where I want the hole to be pierced. And then, as I don't have a hole piercer that particular size, I use a smaller one initially, with a hand braced inside the pot as I cut the hole to stop the rim from distorting. I'll then use the tip of a very sharp knife just to make it a bit wider. And then I'll place a wet sponge on a stick into the hole and twist it vigorously. This makes it larger, again, whilst also creating a very even opening, together with dampening the walls of the pot a touch, which should make joining the spout a bit more straightforward, as it'll match the consistency of the spout, thus making things like cracks forming around the join less likely. I then thin the sides of the spout, as ideally I want these to match the strength of the rim of the pot. And then using a sponge on a stick, I smoothed over the inside of the spout just to clean up any of those rough cut edges. I then use a serrated kidney to roughen up the clay around the hole, and I do the same thing on the end of the spout. I also submerge the end of the spout I'll be attaching to the pourer in a basin of water. This way the clay really softens and it makes it far easier to mesh into the body of the pourer. I push the spout firmly against the pot with fingers once again positioned inside the vessel so that the circular opening isn't distorted as this new appendage is attached. I can then blend in all the soft clay from the spout that's been squashed against the body into the pourer itself, creating a much more natural join between the two. I can then clean up the join from the inside, creating a smooth, flush surface so that there are no jagged edges that might interrupt the flow of liquid. There wasn't quite enough clay in these top joins, so I added 2 small coils of clay, which I blended in just to give this portion of the spout a bit more visual strength. And then with a knife, I very carefully cut the top, creating neater, nicer lines. Ultimately, with pots like this, with clay that is quite grogged and rough, I can only get it so neat at this stage, without those specks of grog dragging across the surface and ruining my careful, fastidious work. And so with spouts like this, I'll sometimes leave them at a certain point, bisquify them, and then I'll use sandpaper to do the finishing touches. This might be a bit of an unconventional way of doing it, but there's only so much fussing around you can do at this leather hard stage before the spout just disintegrates, whereas once the pot has been bisquified to 1000 degrees Celsius, you have a lot more leeway. Although I wouldn't get into the habit of finishing your pots like this. It creates a lot of dust that's not the best to breathe in, and in most cases, with enough practice, you should be able to create a result that's sufficiently good at the leather hard stage. The spout gets placed into the water to soften it, and some slip is brushed into the scored marks on the pot. This acts like glue, almost, helping to soften the region where the spout is going to be attached. I'd say the trickiest thing about joining these is pushing it on with enough pressure without deforming the lip of the spout itself. I've attached this one at a more upward facing angle, which I hope will make the stream of liquid flow with a bit more potency as compared to the more horizontal version you saw at the start, which, whilst it did pour well, it sort of just dribbles out, and I think I can do better than that. I also want both of these spouts to have more of a natural curve to them, so visually they look as if they've grown from the pot, rather than looking obviously tacked on. Once coated in glaze and fired, it'll look more organic too, as the layer of glass will hide any of the small blemishes, making for a completely flush and even surface. I burnish over those sponged areas with a wet finger, just to compress any of the coarse specks of sand back into the body. And lastly, I make sure that the opening is nice and round, as when working so close to the rim it's really easy to distort the shape. And that's this one finished, which I'll also sand a touch once it's been bisque fired, just to tidy up the interior length of the spout. I'm much happier with these two though. The shapes feel more intentional, and I think they'll pour better. Although sadly I can't really test that at this stage. I could if the walls of these were more thickly potted, but as this pour is quite delicate with thin walls and spout, I don't want to risk filling this up with liquid, as the walls could very easily and quickly degrade and split. And with a few finishing touches, I think I can call it a day with these two. The last thing to do is spray them both liberally with water, and then I'll wrap them up tightly with plastic. This should stop any cracks from forming as they dry. I hope you liked seeing how these two pots were put together, and if you made it all the way to the end, thank you so much. That alone means a huge amount to me, not to mention all your likes and comments. I always love reading what you guys have to say. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, I'll see you next time.